Rwanda's President Paul Kagame has emerged as an internationally renowned figure, particularly for building a prosperous and harmonious new country on the ruins of the old one. But his is an unconventional life that has seen him being a poor refugee in Uganda, a top military official in the Ugandan army, and now the president of Rwanda. Paul Kagame's family fled Rwanda's pre-independence ethnic persecution and violence in 1961, crossing into Uganda, where Kagame spent 30 years as a refugee. He then had a military career which got him involved in some of the most extraordinary events and even wars of the 20th century. Paul Kagame was a founding member of current Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni's rebel army, and he then headed its intelligence wing, helping Mr. Museveni take power in 1986. Afterwards, as the leader of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the RPF, Kagame swept into Rwanda to halt the Hutus' genocide against their fellow Tutsis in 1994. The man known as Paul Kagame was born into a Tutsi family in 1957 in what was called the Tambwe commune, located some 65 kilometers west of Kigali, Rwanda's capital. Kagame's father, Deogratius Rutagambwa, was a successful businessman and also had agricultural interests. Paul Kagame's mother, Asturia, was a cousin of Rwanda's Queen Rosalie Gisanda, the wife of King Mutara III. It is fair to say that the family led a pretty comfortable life by Rwandan standards of the day. Their connection to royalty afforded the family some protection from periodic violent political campaigns waged by Rwanda's Hutu majority against the majority Tutsi elite. In this case, the European colonial powers, Germany and then Belgium, had exploited ethnic divisions among Rwanda's population, favoring the country's Tutsis over the Hutu ethnic group. In 1959, as Rwanda prepared for independence from Belgium, a violent incident sparked a Hutu uprising in which hundreds of Tutsis were killed and thousands displaced and forced to flee to neighboring countries. This wave of violence marked the start of the so-called Hutu Peasant Revolution, or the Social Revolution in Rwanda, which lasted from 1959 to 1961. This period signified the end of Tutsi domination and the sharpening of ethnic tensions within the country. At the height of the violence, local peasants armed with machetes, clubs, spears, and a few rifles were moving around the hilltops from village to village, setting light to homes and evicting or killing their residents. As such, when the mood in the country turned really violent, Paul Kagame's family would have been targeted along with other leading Tutsis for arrest and harassment by the perpetrators. This is why the 2-year-old Paul Kagame and his family fled their home with only the belongings they could carry. Shortly afterwards, their house was emptied of the remaining valuables and razed to the ground by looters. Many years later, Paul Kagame would revisit his birthplace only to find an almost empty hill and just 1 or 2 older survivors of the massacres. From their home in Tambwe, the family fled for nearby Nyanza, where they spent 2 weeks before continuing northwards to Paul's mother's birthplace of Mutara near the Ugandan border. There was, however, little prospect of any return to security and normalcy for the foreseeable future, and so in 1961, the family decided to move across the border to Uganda, the country which was to become their home for the next 3 decades. They joined with other groups of Rwandans who were streaming across the border during those years and moved further into Uganda's Ankole province, where refugee camps had by then been set up for Rwandan exiles. After some time, the family moved again, going further north and finally arriving at another refugee camp in Toro district, where they settled in mid-1962. They stayed there for the rest of Paul's childhood years. Life as a refugee in Uganda for the Rwandans fleeing ethnic persecution in the early 1960s was very hard. The refugee camps for those who were able to reach them were poorly equipped and infrequently supplied.
I was a refugee for 25 years, so almost the first part, 15, 20 years, were difficult. There's no question about it. The conditions under which we lived, whether it was feeding as in the family.
Eventually, the refugees were allocated some land by the local Ugandan authorities to cultivate, but many ended up working as cheap labor for the local farmers in order to make ends meet. Despite these early hardships, the Rwandan exiles in 1959 and the subsequent years gradually began to integrate into Ugandan society, learning English and speaking less and less French, the language of their former colonial masters. Soon, many came to see themselves as Ugandans in practical terms, and as the months of exiles turned to years, then decades, much of that direct association with the motherland began to diminish. At the same time, political conditions back home remained unfavorable for a safe return, leaving the exiles in Uganda condemned to a state of long-term limbo. Their children were not spared from ill treatment in this foreign land. The young Rwandans, including Paul Kagame, were often subject to harassment, often reminding them of their outsider status. While in the refugee camp, young Paul Kagame befriended Emmanuel Gisa, who would later adopt the nom de guerre Fred Ruggiema. Fred Ruggiema's family fled Rwanda in 1960 when he was just 3 years old. The two boys, Paul and Fred, became the very best of friends, and people who did not know them thought that they were brothers. Paul Kagame attended primary school in Toro district where he learned English in a class of refugees. This was before moving to a Ugandan state school in Tare from the age of 9, where he finally began to mix with the local population. He performed very well and was at the top of his class in the last year of primary school in Tare. Even at this early age, Kagame's academic achievements were already causing administrative problems for the local authorities of Uganda. According to regulations, the top 3 students in the class qualified for a grant to go on to secondary school. However, since he was not Ugandan, Paul did not qualify, leaving the authorities in the difficult position of having to award the grant to a student with inferior marks or deny him access to the school. Fortunately, Paul Kagame benefited from financial assistance via a family friend based in Belgium that enabled him to continue his schooling, first attending Tare Secondary School. This sense of alienation in Ugandan society was later summarized in an interview with Paul Kagame, and I quote, "Professional advancement was restricted for Rwandans in Uganda. There were limitations on our progress." Paul Kagame's academic performance was not atypical of this generation of young Tutsi refugees. This group that came to be known as the 59ers showed both an appetite and an aptitude for learning and qualifications. However, the death of Paul Kagame's father, Deogratius, in the early 1970s, as well as the departure of Fred Ruggiema to an unknown location, led to a decline in his academic performance. In addition to this, Paul Kagame also developed an increased tendency to fight those who belittled the Rwandan population in Uganda. He was eventually expelled from Tare School and completed his studies without distinction at Old Kampala Secondary School. Through all his childhood, Paul Kagame had never been able to return to Rwanda, but soon the young man felt a growing curiosity to know more about the land of his birth. He began asking his parents about what it was that they had done to become refugees and why their situation continued to be the way it was. The young man was now on a journey of self-discovery, and so in 1977, Kagame arranged through contacts from his school to go to Rwanda and explore the homeland. He yearned to see the places and to know more of what had effectively become a forbidden territory for the young exile. Once he was in his homeland, Paul Kagame traveled more thoroughly in the country, and in this way he made the acquaintance of the real Rwanda. Soon enough, he knew many things about Rwandan life which his fellow exiles in Uganda could only hear about from others or guess about from distant childhood recollections. Kagame visited Rwanda again in 1978, and this time he did not take the chance of crossing the border directly. He first went through the southwest of Uganda into Zaire, and from there he passed through the Rutura area to Goma before crossing into Rwanda by the road to Gisenyi. Rwanda was quiet during those years. Juvenal Habyarimana had taken leadership of the country in 1973, continuing the Hutu line of authority. However, if Rwandan authorities had realized that Paul Kagame was related to the former Tutsi royal family and was a Rwandan refugee living in Uganda, his journey into Rwanda could have become perilous. Paul Kagame later said of the trips that, and I quote, "If someone had found out about me, known who I was from a refugee camp in Uganda and the family I came from, it could have been very dangerous. You had to be very careful then." His trips to Rwanda in 1977 and 1978, although only a few months of time altogether, greatly influenced his thinking and expanded his knowledge of Rwanda's economic and political challenges. The idea of someday returning to Rwanda and becoming involved in the political process was now firmly buttressed in young Paul Kagame's mind. Paul Kagame's life changed significantly when he was introduced to another graduate